Cunningham blood, ain't you? It's got a death curse.
Hello and welcome to another bad movie review. This time we're looking at Friday the 13th from 1980. I highly recommend getting the uncut version because it does add a little bit extra to it, including some gore scenes that were cut from a lot of the releases. So that makes the uncut version unrated, whereas the regular version was rated R. Alright, like I said, this came out in 1980 and with the extra footage has a runtime of about 98 minutes. It was written by Victor Miller, directed by Sean Cunningham, produced by Sean Cunningham, with a budget of about $550,000, but a box office of $59.8 million, roughly. Now, this movie does have a few people in it that might be recognizable from other works, especially Kevin Bacon. It also featured Walt Gorney, who played Crazy Ralph, one of my favorite characters, because if anybody had listened to him, they'd be alive. He was also in Part 2, and he was the uncredited opening narrator of Part 7. He had a lot of bit parts, but a memorable performance in this movie. Also, there was Ronn, Millkie, and then of course you have Adrienne King. She was also in Saturday Night Fever as one of the dancers. Little trivia for you. So the crux of this film is that somebody is reopening Camp Crystal Lake after a tragedy where 2 counselors were murdered many years back. So this guy is trying to get it reopened. He's apparently a descendant of some of the original owners, and he has hired counselors to come in and get ready for the kids that'll be coming. So with only a few weeks to get everything up and running, a lot of things aren't quite reliable. So a lot of the place looks pretty run down still, and the electricity is pretty questionable. So they do have a generator, which does come into play. But unlike a lot of slasher movies, especially later installments, the camp counselors in this aren't necessarily stupid. They are mostly caught off guard or singled out while they're alone. So they're caught unaware, and most of them don't even know about the other victims. Most of the killing takes place during a rainstorm, and they're filtered out one by one. Other people are killed, like Annie the cook, are killed on their way to the camp or returning to the camp, etc. So it's not that the counselors are incompetent, they're just unaware of the actual danger they're in until near the very end. And one of the interesting things is multiple deaths are done off screen. While there is some gore in this, it is very, very much not a gore film. The gore was largely edited out, and that's why it had to be reinserted. And even that was tame by today's standards. So for 1980, it was probably a little bit more gratuitous, but even then, a lot of the gore comes off as fairly uninspired and somewhat realistic in a lot of cases. The only over-the-top scene is a decapitation near the end of the film where the hands are gripping near the neck, and that's really over the top, but it's just a silly kill, whereas the others are fairly realistic. And now the killer also isn't revealed until the last 20 minutes of the film, and it's kept androgynous and ambiguous as to who it could be and why they're doing what they're doing. It's really about an hour and 17 minutes into the film before we even start to get a hint at what the motivation is for the killings. Now, they use some good film techniques to hide the killer's identity and even the gender by having the kills done through the point of view of the killer. Now, that's a technique that they don't use a lot anymore, but it is done very effectively in this film because it keeps the identity of the killer much more androgynous and ambiguous by the use of gloves and boots and flannel. There's a lot of flannel on the killer here. So unlike many of the sequels and other slasher films, the counselors are not just running around like chickens with their heads cut off. They just don't know that there's danger, and they don't know who is hunting them, if it's even happening, if they even suspect it. But the fact that the kills are done off screen, I thought was kind of interesting. Now, the supernatural elements that have become very much a mainstay of the franchise are really not in this film. You don't see anything remotely supernatural until the last several minutes of the film, but it's not really certain that that's an actual event or if that was a hallucination. So they open up the door to it, but it's not a focus of this film. This is just a straight slasher flick, and the killer has a motivation for it. It's not just pointless, gratuitous deaths. There is a motivation for the killer, and it does set the foundation for the franchise, but it also was very self-contained, so it could be a one-off movie if they didn't get funding for the next one, which the funding did budget double for the next film, so they were able to do a lot more in part 2 than they could in part 1. But overall, this is largely not that exciting of a film. If it had just been a standalone film, it probably would have been forgotten. It's a decent slasher film, but you only get one set of boobs, the body count's only about 10 people, and since they cut out a lot of the gore for a lot of the releases, it's really almost not that memorable in a lot of cases. Even movies like Sleepaway Camp did some of this at least on par with this film, so there are elements of this that are kind of generic looking, but this was actually the grandfather for a lot of slasher flicks. Yeah, Halloween came first, but this one set the tone for the whole idea of the summer camp killers, and that inspired movies like Sleepaway Camp and several others. Now, is this movie worth watching? Absolutely. It's a good horror film, it's a good popcorn film, but it is not the best of the series. I think it is technically probably the most consistent with its era for a horror film, but it's really not the best horror movie of its era. I think the sequels did a much better job of bringing audiences in. Now, this movie did do very well at the box office, but it really is kind of lost in the shuffle of the movies that were later inspired by it. So if you have seen a bunch of other slasher movies and never seen this will look a little generic, I think. I'd still recommend watching it, especially if you're going to watch any of the other movies. This really does have the foundation for those films. And the sets look really good. The acting's a little rough in spots, but it's totally passable, especially for a slasher flick. The fight choreography really needed work, and you could tell they were cutting corners to save on the budget with those scenes, especially because the kills that really would have been harder to do are done off screen. So this is one of the grandparents of slasher films for the modern era, but it really does look a bit dated by today's standards, but I still have a special place in my heart for this as far as slasher films go, and it did set the foundation for the franchise. It did give us Jason Voorhees. I think the twist of who the killer is interesting. I think the background was more interesting, and they should have gone more into that. I think that would have been a pretty interesting thing to have introduced earlier in the film, but it does a good job of building tension and things like that. So a decent horror movie, but not the best of the franchise, but still a classic because of what it spawned. It's kind of an outlier in its own franchise because of the way it's done, but I would absolutely say get the uncut version. It does add a lot more to the film because of the blood element, if nothing else. And with such a low body count, you really need that extra little bit in there of those few minutes. So a worthy film of watching, especially for the historical aspects of what it inspired later down the line and the sequels that it spawned. And it does have a fairly decent story. Plus, it's got Kevin Bacon. So that's going to do it for this one. Thank you so much for listening and supporting the channel. If you enjoyed this, please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future reviews. If you'd like to help the channel out in other ways, links are in the description to various support methods. And as always, we hope to see you on the next one.